Hey guys, this is Coach Barryline. We're going to talk today or continue our discussion of industrialization today via video. We're going to talk and compare the United States and Russia during this period at this time. So the United States and Russia take two very different tracks along the industrial path. In the United States, you have explosive growth, very pro-business government at the time. Mass production for a mass market developed, and you had the development of Henry Ford, Andrew Carnegie, and Rockefeller as John D. Rockefeller as cultural heroes, and not as villains as the wealthy elite are often depicted in Russia. However, you still have the difficult working and living conditions that many industrial working class faced throughout Europe and the United States as well. So thanks to access to resources and a fusion of European capital, the U.S. saw a very rapid process of industrialization during this time. And they developed self-sustaining investments and didn't need to rely on foreign investments for developing that industrialization. So by 1914, the United States was already a major world industrial power. It produced over a third of the world's industrial output. During this time, you do have pro-business governments in the United States. Government support was essential to this growth. You had land grants, very low taxes, and a tolerance of monopolies that allowed massive industrial concerns to generate profits and products. So as a result, mass production develops very quickly in the Americas. These new techniques that Americans pioneered were the assembly lines, mass marketing, and things like mail order catalogs, urban department stores. All of these things combined to create a culture of consumption that really a lot of people would argue is still with us today. As a result, you have this kind of small elite group of industrialists emerge as incredibly wealthy individuals, and they become almost like pop culture heroes in American culture. People like Henry Ford, Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller. America came to see itself as the place where things like that happen. Free from Europe's aristocratic prejudices. Basically, these industrials are seen as self-made heroes who kind of embodied the entrepreneurial spirit of hard work in America, which considered itself the land of opportunity. However, the industrial working class still faced very difficult lives, long hours and dangerous conditions in factories, housing in very cramped and poorly sanitized, poorly lit, and poorly ventilated tenements led to disease epidemics and very short lifespan for especially the urban poor during this time. So even though America saw itself as superior to the Europeans in many ways, it also had the same kind of problems for the working class during the Industrial Revolution. As you can see by this map, the Industrial Revolution, or the United States, was blessed with a lot of deposits of major resources. You see the green, which has the coal in it. The blue are iron deposits, and you have silver and gold mining throughout other parts, as you can see, of the country. So we were blessed with resources and lots of arable land that could be farmed. Now, the United States did industrialize without socialist influence that we see in Russia, but there was conflict. Strikes were common and generally dealt with rather brutally, but there was not much political organization amongst the workers, and many unions were conservative, and there was the extra aspect of racial politics and the high standards of living that exist during this time frame. So there were populists, there were progressives, there were people trying to work for those things, but generally very few socialists. So anyway, strikes and class conflict existed for the United States. So even though there is class conflict, generally political organization was weak in the United States amongst the working class. There were strikes, and some even became violent. Haymarket Strike in 1877, often state militia or federal troops would be called in, and there were tense relations between the classes. However, American labor never fully organized as a political party. Socialism had few followers in a culture that really admired independence and didn't like the idea of big government. Additionally, the labor movement was led by unions that were focused more on skilled laborers early on than on unskilled laborers. So these unions were generally less radical than those that supported unskilled laborers. Also, racial, ethnic, and religious tensions amongst the American labor force hindered class solidarity. There were racial divisions and ethnic divisions and national divisions amongst workers in the United States that prevented them from uniting. And also, there was a higher standard of living than anywhere else in the world. So workers in the United States were generally a little bit better off than the European labor class. So along with the growing middle class, radical politics, along with the higher standard of living, along with the growing middle class, basically led to few followers of real radical politics. However, some populist and progressive did emerge, and there were reform movements such as the small farmers of the populace who rallied against banks and industrialists and the financial system, as well as both major political parties. Basically, the populists claimed that the Republicans and Democrats were both more or less in the pockets of the East Coast banks. And the progressives, which kind of grew up in both parties, sought to reform working, living, and sanitation conditions to make American life better. Socialism in either its moderate or radical form won few supporters. Although, as we'll see after World War I, there is a growth of socialist fervor and a backlash against it during that time. In Russia, unlike the United States, you have a much more radical approach to industrialization. So Russia is the complete opposite of the United States in many ways. It was politically repressive and dominated by the titled nobility. The boyars of Russia often spoke French better than Russian, so there was very little identification between the elites of Russia and the commoners, the labor class. So in this case, whereas in the United States, change often came from the bottom up, Russia had a history of state-sponsored change and reform, very open hostility towards popular movements. Peter the Great's reforms would be a good example. That was top down. The Tsar was doing it. 1861 emancipation of the serfs by Alexander II, I believe, after the Crimean War is another example. These are top down reforms. Also, Russia industrializes very rapidly. They're behind the rest of Europe in beginning that process, but once it begins, it is a rapid industrialization, and this obviously produces social conflict. So starting in the 1890s, the Russian state used foreign money to fund this industrialization, and it was based primarily on railroads and heavy industry. The gains were impressive, but the social upheaval caused by the rise of this new middle class and a new labor, impoverished working class, which Marxists called the proletariat, creates serious social instability. So much like working class, the labor class, whatever you want to call them, the working poor in Russia faced a lot of the same problems that they did other places, except in many cases it's worse in Russia because Russia didn't have the social and economic structure to support these new cities and these new workers. So what you have in Russia is the birth of a very small but very radical proletariat. Less than 5% of the population was industrial working class, but they lived in difficult conditions and they became increasingly radicalized. And you can see in this map the radicalization and the problems that you see. There are peasant unrest and land seizures, army mutinies, naval mutinies, major strikes all over the place. And even many workers in larger cities form what are called Soviets, and these are local workers' councils. So toward the end of the 18 and into the early 1900s, there is lots of labor and class-based unrest going on in Russia. So it's during this time you have the birth of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. 1905 is kind of a bellwether year that leads to some reforms, but not quickly enough. So from 1905 you have the growth of revolutionary parties, and finally in 1917 you have the Russian Revolution, and then shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution. So the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was illegally founded in 1898, and it sought to use Marxism to create change in Russia. And some strands of the party were radical revolutionaries. So in 1905, during a disastrous war with Japan that Russia was humiliated by losing, there was a spontaneous uprising of workers in St. Petersburg. As workers went out on strikes and formed the Soviets, the Tsar basically initially responded with repression, but also agreed to grant limited reforms, forming the first legislative body in Russia known as the Duma. Now, most of these were just ploys by the Tsar's government to try to put down the revolts, and very soon he was pretty much back to business as usual. So what happens is after 1905, when people's expectations were raised by these reforms and they come to realize that they're not going to happen, people become more satisfied and more revolutionary parties are born and grow. The Bolsheviks become the most notable of these parties. 1917, Russia has been plunged into a full-scale revolution by the destruction of World War I. And by the end of the year, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who was the leader of the Marxist Bolshevik Party, that says racial, it should say radical Marxist Bolshevik Party, was in power, and they had overthrown the provisional government and were in power, embarking on a revolutionary experiment to basically establish a whole new classless society. So it's a very quick discussion, glancing discussion, if you will, of the Russian Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution. But basically what you see in the United States and Russia, you see two very different approaches. You're going to wind up with the bottom, kind of a more organic industrialization in the United States, whereas in Russia it's going to be much more planned and top-down kind of deal. So you see two very different countries, and we'll talk more about each of them as we move on in our next unit. But thought it would be important to kind of see the similarities and differences between the two. In the next video, we're going to talk a little about the Industrial Revolution and its impacts on Latin America. We'll see you then.